there are many people who ask me, will JSS succeed? Given that this is not the first time we try to integrate Johor and Singapore economy. Since 1965, this is probably the third major effort to try to integrate Johor and Singapore economy. In 1989, the then Deputy Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong, who later became Prime Minister, proposed the idea of Sijori. And the idea of Sijori is to integrate Singapore, Johor, and Rail Islands. That didn't go very far because by 1994, Singapore was already in Suzhou. And the China team became so important to Singapore, and the Sijori idea gradually faded away. In 2006, the late Tun Abdullah Badawi, under the premiership of the late Tun Abdullah Badawi, Malaysia proposed Iskandar region. And that was a great idea. The idea initially seems very promising, but after a while, it became property play, and the idea was about attracting Singaporeans to spend, and attracting Singapore high spender to spend in Johor. There was no integration of supply chain, or there was no integration of the workforce. But I think this time is different. This time is different because both sides recognize that the world has changed. The world has changed in a way that we have not seen in generations, or at least in a generation. The world has changed from prioritizing or having this general assumption of just in time, of having just one single global supply chain, to one that is now focusing on or putting as a premise from just in time to just in case. We are now dealing with risks. Everyone is worried about risk rather than efficiency. Or efficiency is no longer the only priority. Risk is also a very major concern for corporations. We're dealing with thinking of a single global supply chain to now thinking of multiple regional supply chain. The idea that you can move container boxes anywhere, everywhere in the world without hindrance, I think that idea is dead. And the situation is not just about supply chain, it is also about geopolitics. Suddenly those who study international relations, those who study politics like myself has more chance to make a living. Suddenly geopolitics is at the center of global trade. And we're not going to be able to avoid it. We will have to deal with it. And therefore, the integration of Johor and Singapore economies become very important. It becomes very important and it becomes beneficial to both sides, which is why I think this time is different. This time, if we do it well, if we can integrate the Johor and Singapore economy well, we will be able to create something very meaningful for both Johor and Singapore, for Malaysia and Singapore, and for ASEAN, and perhaps adds to the global change. I look at our economy. I think we can probably divide our economy into the following phases. For the longest of time, up until probably 1970s, the Malaysian-Singapore economy was essentially a mercantile or resource-based economy. We were doing trading for colonial economy. We're doing trading based on resources, tin, rubber, later on palm oil. But that has moved to a more outsourced manufacturing economy, with Singapore leading the way in the early 60s and Malaysia followed suit in the 70s and subsequently. The idea was we became outsourced manufacturing hubs particularly for the US economy. Of course, eventually the role was taken over by China, and Singapore also became a financial hub and not just a manufacturing hub. But I think this is a time for us to think of a 3.0 for Malaysia and Singapore economy, and perhaps for the world economy, given the context I have outlined earlier. A 3.0 is about not just about make in Malaysia. First phase was about colonial mercantile trading system or trading economy based on resources. The second phase was about make in Malaysia, make in Singapore, make for the United States, make for the global market. But I think we are entering into a potential third phase. It is about make by Malaysia, by creating our own IP, by creating our own innovation. And I think Singapore shares the same aspiration to create our own technology, to no longer just think about being a user but also being a creator. And if we imagine that Johor and Singapore can become a very strong cluster, if we imagine that the financial capital in Singapore, the financial capability in Singapore, together with Johor, if we can create innovations, if we can create new technologies here, we will be a very important region. And we may have to now shift the way we think. We've always been thinking about exporting to the United States, because the United States is the consumer of the last resort, and in many instances, the consumer of the first resort. But it's time for us to think about creating technology for ASEAN, creating technology for India, Bangladesh, for Brazil, for the bottom billions. And if we can imagine that Malaysia and Singapore combined, we can create technology giants, we can create technological companies that will provide not necessarily the high tech, but middle tech, provide technology, create technology for the rest of the world, will be in a very interesting position. And for Malaysia and Singapore economy to succeed, and to succeed in a new era, it is important that we always keep in mind that combined Malaysia and Singapore economy can actually help power change in ASEAN. The world is shifting. And ASEAN is an interesting work in progress. If we can strengthen ASEAN, and if we can create ASEAN as a very strong and coherent unit, it will help everyone. And to make ASEAN a very strong unit, we need to be able to create a middle class in ASEAN. We need to see the Indonesian being rich. We need to see the Cambodians being a middle class, or having a middle class. And when I say middle class, what do we mean by middle class? We mean by having enough people who have discretionary power to spend, who have discretionary spending, and who have enough disposable income so that they can make discretionary spending. And that there are actually very few in ASEAN. So imagine that in 20 years' time, by 2045, we can create a middle class in ASEAN. That means ASEAN will have consumers. ASEAN becomes a consumer base, and we're not seeing ourselves just as producer, we're also seeing ourselves as consumer. And we will be able to create a lot more two-way, three-way trades with other regions. And if the world has a strong ASEAN, if the world has an ASEAN that is not just producers but also consumer, the world will also be an interesting place. Then you will imagine that United States is a consumer market, EU is a consumer market, China is a consumer market, India is a consumer market, ASEAN is a strong consumer market, and of course Africa may be able to get its act together, and it may be an interesting region. And with the Middle East, the world becomes not in the current structure, but in a very different structure. Which is why I take you around the world, because I see the importance of what we are doing. You are actually in my constituency, my state constituency. I'm both MP for Iskandar Putri and also Adun for Berlin. But I want to take you to this broader picture because I think what you are doing now today, what we are doing together today is important. It's not just about Johor and Singapore. It also has wider implication, and if we do well, we play a small role in creating a better world. Thank you very much. Thank you to Maybank for sponsoring, and thank you everyone for attending.